World Trash 12. Is the email name. It's called Real World Heavy Lifting Experience. Brothers, I am a maintenance foreman for my company in the Gulf of Mexico offshore. I've spent my whole career, about 22 years worth, lifting, moving, sliding, and removing huge loads off of boats.
Here,
and
turn the fan down in the back.
Then sliding them, lifting them, and placing them in exact locations so that everything lines up. Believe it or not, we work in and with tolerances to match machine shops. Our alignments and repairs are within 0.000 to 0.040, depending on what part of the machinery we are dealing with. He doesn't give a... Yeah, I'm guessing CM, I don't know. The lifts we make can be up to...
I think that's inches.
Could be inches, yeah. The lifts we make can be up to 50,000 to 200,000 pounds. We are mostly capped no matter what size crane we can use around 100 tons. I know exactly what can and can't be done with our modern machinery. I understand completely what our limitations are with the technology we have right now. I have been obsessed with ancient stone moving my whole life. I have absorbed almost every written or watched pieces of information I can get my hands on. Even with all the things I've seen suspended in air at the weights we deal with, I am in awe. I am awestruck how our ancestors completed the absolute freakish feats they did with huge stone blocks. There are so many complications involved in what it's a one-way road. And I mean literally huge complications. There is no way that these things were done the way our so-called experts tried to tell us they did. When I listen to all of the talk about how they were made, and by who, I feel like we are bypassing the most important issue: logistics and capability to move and place these monumental stone blocks, especially over great distances. When we load a 200-foot boat to bring us our lifts, you would be surprised at how quickly that room is taken up. So how you would remove, lift, load, lift, unload, and then set in place is beyond me. So, set with rope and wooden tooling. It is truly laughable. I would love to have a conversation with you all just to express some of the difficulties of these types of lifting operations. Maybe just to help everyone understand the mountains of issues they would have doing these things with the rigging that the historians are saying they use. I by no means can say how they accomplished it, but I can tell you how they did not, for sure. Thank you for all your time, and keep up the great work, and have a great day.
Man, that is great.
Yeah.
That's really great to hear from somebody who actually does this all the time.
Yes.
That's really cool. For us, we look at it and we're like, well, we've kind of lifted some heavy loads with like some fairly powerful machines.
Yeah, but nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
The oil field stuff is like, on a whole other scale.
I would like to know more about that.
I would too. I think we might ought to get this dude on, maybe. I'll see. Or we can get Laura. Yeah.
She's got a fever.
Yeah.
I'm on it.
And the only cure is more gas.
Okay, let's see what we got here. This is called Egypt 2022 from Jared. So I have to say thank you guys. Thank you guys and Ben from Uncharted X for going strong and never stopping the beautiful work to bring us the ancient world in a way that many more are starting to look at. This is unorthodox. I have been listening for years, and I am an avid ancient history seeker since I was 12, and I am 38 coming soon this year. I love hearing all the theories and knowledge you guys are bringing to light, along with many others in this changing age of history. The one thing I love about you guys is also the music. I've been drumming since I was 10, and making music is special. I don't get to it much these days, but I love hearing people make music that moves you. Moves us in a way that makes us feel like we are there, or part of your journeys through these ancient places. And by the ancients, the last song from Egypt hit me like a serpent in the sky. Effing beautiful, you guys. Thank you. Thank you for bringing us, the ones who can't afford to go, or even
tickets for the last year, but nobody
just out of this world for sure. After the last Egypt tour podcast with Ben, you guys played a lot of music through it. I want that last song. I will pay. It is amazing. Great job. I feel it in my soul and wish one day to afford a trip with everyone to ride along the journey with you two, Ben and Randall and whoever else. Keep doing what you're doing for all of us. Thank you, from Jared, a seeker of ancient history's truth.
Wow,
that's cool. So I think there's a couple of things. I think he's talking about as far as the song goes, the jam that we did at the beach.
It's either the jam from the beach or it's.
I'm pretty sure that was when yes, it's either one of those.
Yeah.
So you should put that jam from the beach on the Patreon.
Yeah. And they'll both be there. Because
Yes.
Salam is up there, yeah.
Yeah, but also if you want to see the, if it's Salam, if you want to see the progression that's happening with the writing of that song, go to the Dynasty Patreon.
Ah,
There's 3 versions, and it shows how like it went from the original one that I recorded on this.
Maybe I should take Grand
My
Central.
Snake Bros brick in Egypt. And then the second version is when I came back here in this studio and redid some of the instrumentation and the vocals with these nice mics. And the next version after that, Ty's guitar comes in. So it's kind of, you know,
That's cool.
it's still working.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Progress.
I told this story, but after the tour ended, Ben and Kyle and I went and got some rooms in a hotel near to Yusuf's place to chill for a couple of days before we went to Sharm el Sheikh with Yusuf. And the whole time, Ben and I are hanging out. Ben's like, "Well, where's Kyle?" I'm like, "He's working, bro, making music." Kyle's like hiding in stairwells.
Wait till the restaurant closes and sneak up there.
Sneak up to the restaurant after it closes so he can have some quiet. Yeah, making music on his phone. It was awesome.
Good job, babe.
Thanks, babe. And I guess we should throw out there that on the live stream that we just played, what was it, 284? We played some more music of Kyle's that people have asked for, so I will be putting that on the Patreon as well.
Yeah, that one is a new one I've been working on, and even since that live stream did a lot of work to it.
Yeah, so that one is going to be used on one of the upcoming produced videos we're making. Murray promised us money if we put that song on the Patreon.
You better freaking join the Patreon.
Yeah, we are not. Yeah.
This is the reason why we're putting it up there.
That's putting away.
I don't actually
What?
believe he's going to do it.
You're awake.
Nobody better do it. He's a huge troll. Like, we learned this, and
he was right about the sound, though. he was like, "Bro, your mic is too damn loud." And Russ was like, "Bro, don't listen to
that guy.
I'm like, "No, he told me, like,
Yeah,
sure enough, I've listened back."
Last live, he was like, "All I hear is static," right? That was his comment.
He was right, giant troll. Don't listen to Russ.
Hey,
all right?
this is your moment, Murray. This is your moment to really put this all to rest here.
Okay, so I got some Patreon uploads to do. So let's see, we got. This is the other thing that's been happening. It happens in this one, but now people are actually addressing Grumpy Morning Russ in their emails. Like, you don't want to do that. You don't want to talk to that guy. He doesn't want to talk to you, right? Don't talk to it. Just pretend that
And
you're
don't
sending.
poke. Don't poke.
Right. It's like imagine Grumpy Morning Russ is like the screener. You don't talk to the screener in the email. What did you say?
People do.
It's a
I'm
bad
not going to say
idea.
the names,
It's a
but
bad idea. You don't want to do it.
Snurdly was always being talked to.
I know. I know. I'm just telling you that, like, you don't want to talk to this guy. You know, he doesn't want to talk to you. He is reading your emails and screening them for someone else who is like podcast Russ. This is a different person.
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
From Travis, it's
Speed camera ahead.
Russ and Kyle. Howdy, buddy.
Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Okay. All right, we're holding on.
I think that Kyle is sometimes.
Grumpy Morning Kyle.
Alright, go.
I want to get that out there on the podcast. Kyle always
We are
says.
not going to have
Kyle always says, "Babe, just talk about it on the podcast." There we go, babe. Moving on.
All right. So Travis says, I should have written to you guys about 100 times by now. I started listening somewhere around episode 100, and I'm now slithering through the back catalog for the 3rd time.
Wow.
Just last Tuesday, the 14th, as in 3/14, I came to an episode where you, Russ, announced it's Pi Day, and I coiled up and my dorsal scale stood on end. Everything moves in circles. I have heard that the reason for everything moving in circles is that we live in Maya, or the illusion of life, and that we are trying to break free. I imagine it is like being caught in the eddy alongside a river where the water stagnates.
Did he say we live in Maya?
Maya. It's
Whoa. That's interesting.
yeah. M-A.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet. Today we're pitting facts against fortune tellers. I'm here with Blythe Terrell, our editor. Hey Blythe.
Hey, Wendy.
So, last week, big pandemic news. The World Health Organization declared that COVID is no longer a global emergency anymore. While COVID isn't going
Just
anywhere, my friends just
What?
had it.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm calling this a big symbolic step towards the end of the official pandemic.
Right.
And so we thought on the show it was a really good time to go back to this episode that we made a few years ago.
Yeah, okay. So this is an episode we made before the pandemic, and it's a fictional episode where we pretended that a dangerous virus was spreading. And we scripted it, we hired actors, and actually we even, Wendy, you might remember, we talked to somebody very special.
Yes, Anthony Fauci. That Anthony Fauci. He was still the, fancy pants at the NIH, talking to presidents, but he had time to talk to us about this fictional pandemic, and then he actually listened to the episode you're about to hear, this sort of fake world we created, listened to it while we were all just like, what's he gonna think? What's he gonna think? And then he commented and gave us notes.
And wait, Wendy, the episode came out when? Remind us.
So Fauci listened, and then this episode came out in October of 2019. And then 2 months later, reports started coming out of Wuhan about a weird pneumonia, which would obviously then become the real pandemic. So what we want to do now is play the episode for you in its entirety, which involves this interview with Fauci, and then this fictional episode that we come back to Fauci, and he'll tell us how we did. And Blythe and I are gonna now listen in the studio, and neither of us have listened for a really long time. Definitely not since the actual pandemic happened. I think it's gonna be tough. I think it's gonna be tough.
Are you nervous?
Yeah. And I think our audience, whoever had a particularly tough pandemic, I do want people to take care while they're listening to this.
Yeah, it gets intense.
It does. Okay. All right. So, let's go back to simpler times. October 2019. Old Town Road from Lil Nas X was still playing over and over. It should have been. And then we dropped this episode. Here at Science Versus, we love a pandemic disaster movie as much as the next person.
Life as we know it will come to an end in 90 days. Every single person that you or I has ever known is dead!
You got 19 dead, you got hundreds more infected, and it's spreading like a brush fire. You gotta isolate the sick, and I mean really isolate them.
We're doing that, Sam. No, we're not doing it!
Watching these films, you get the idea that if there was a pandemic, basically all of humanity would be destroyed. All that would be left is Will Smith and his dog.
No, let's go!
But what would it really?
Save 5 minutes via Sprainbrook Parkway North.
No.
To find out, we called up the guy.
I'm one of the people. I wouldn't say the guy.
This humble fella is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And despite this organization's tame name, it's Anthony's job to directly advise presidents about scary diseases threatening the US. Anthony has been in this field for so long that he's advised 6 presidents. Do you have a favorite?
No. They're different. That I can say. But I don't play favorites.
Anthony has talked to presidents about HIV, Zika, Ebola. So I asked him, of all the diseases out there, which one is most likely to turn into a pandemic?
Well, influenza overwhelmingly is the most likely.
The flu? That's the scariest? I mean, when we look at what's happening with Ebola, it feels much scarier than the flu.
Well, yes, I mean, Ebola appears to be much scarier than the flu because it has a very high mortality, but it is much less easy to transmit from one person to another.
So, for example, you can't get Ebola unless you come into contact with the bodily fluids of someone who's infected, say their blood. But with the flu, you can get infected from someone just breathing next to you. Now, there are lots of different strains or versions of the flu out there. The CDC actually has a hit list of the most dangerous, and at the top of that list is a flu virus called H7N9. It's been circulating in China for around 5 years. And H7N9 is scary because it's killing about 40% of the people who are infected. That's more than 200 times more deadly than the typical flu. But you've probably never heard of H7N9 for one very simple reason.
It's a chicken virus that easily goes from chicken to chicken. It occasionally jumps from a chicken to a human.
Right now, it doesn't spread easily from human to human. But viruses do mutate all the time. So we wanted to know what would happen if a virus like H7N9 did evolve so that it spread easily from person to person. And on today's show, we're going to imagine that happening. We've created a fictional world where this disease has mutated and is spreading fast. To make this episode, we consulted with more than 20 researchers, including scientists at the Institute for Disease Modeling and the CDC. So what you're about to hear is fictional world, fictional people, but it's based on real science. Think Contagion, but with citations. And your guide to this world is a fictional host called Mindy Tuckerman. Science versus Pandemic starts now.
Prepare to lead with a highly ranked degree from Baruch College's Marx School of Public and International Affairs. Marx offers flexible, affordable graduate and executive level degrees in public administration, international affairs, and higher education administration, drawing upon one of the largest public affairs faculty in the nation. Register for a virtual open house on May 23rd and learn more at marx.baruch.cuny.edu. That's marxe.baruch.cuny.edu.
Take a seat at the table with AT Still University's 100% online Doctor of Medical Science program. This degree is a PA-specific doctorate designed by and exclusively for physician assistants. Customize your degree by specializing in education, leadership, global health, public health emergency preparedness, public health workforce, or develop an individualized practicum. For more information, visit atsu.edu.
Obviously, the president is very concerned about the recent cases of H7N9 flu in China. The president is monitoring the situation closely and has ordered an active, aggressive, and coordinated response.
Hey, I'm Mindy Tuckerman, and you're listening to Facts Versus. What you're hearing is from a White House press conference earlier today.
There are some things that it's important for people to understand. Flu viruses are extremely unpredictable and variable.
We've just heard that a deadly flu virus circulating in China has mutated. With this new virus, basically no one has immunity.
We will keep a close eye on this virus as it progresses. I'll take your questions.
Are there any confirmed cases in the U.S.? The president is considering closing the border.
As far as we know, this flu virus hasn't left China yet, but the way people are talking about this disease, it seems certain it will hit the U.S. soon. To find out what we're dealing with here, I flew to CDC headquarters.
And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Atlanta. Scientists here study this new virus in a level 3 biosafety lab. There's double security doors, biosafety jumpsuits, you know, the ones with the mask and respirator. For me to get closer?
No.
And what I'm seeing are a lot of ferrets. What's that one's name?
We don't really give them names. It's probably like 12.
Red light camera in 0.1 mile.
The head of the influenza division laboratories at CDC. She told me that the CDC uses ferrets to study how quickly this new virus will spread. And why use ferrets?
When they get the flu, their symptoms are similar to ours. Sneezing, mucus buildup, lack of appetite, fatigue.
Season 5 of The Good Wife.
I guess. Point is, we use them to help map how contagious this new virus is.
A researcher is sticking the virus up one of the ferret's noses. To keep track of the ferrets, I'll call this one Will Ferret.
So tomorrow we're going to put that infected ferret,
Will Ferret,
in a cage next to a healthy ferret. They'll be divided by some mesh to stop them from touching each other, and then we'll wait and see if the healthy ferret gets sick.
We should call the healthy guy Ferret Bueller. You know, because he might get a sick day off. Dr. Morales and her team do this to a bunch of ferrets at once. It's not just Will and Ferris. A couple of days later, I come back to the lab to check on them. They don't look good. How many ferrets got sick?
More than we were expecting, and 3 out of 8 are dead. This virus is highly contagious. We test a lot of flu viruses every week, and this one sticks out.
Rosie says, based on what we're already seeing in China and in this lab, here's what it's looking like. Say you're on a packed subway car at peak hour, and someone coughs. With any flu, maybe 4 people will get infected. But with this virus, possibly 10 people could get infected. That means at the moment, we think this virus is highly contagious and deadly. So, how are we here? I mean, it's not in the US yet, right?
Well, the virus could actually already be here. We just may not know it yet. If it makes you feel any better, I'm still catching the subway. For now.
Two months since flu virus mutation. Worldwide death toll, over 1
Why
million.
is this lane so long?
Hey, I'm Mindy Tuckerman. You're listening to Facts Versus. It's been 2 months since we first started talking about the killer flu. Over 1 million are dead worldwide. In New York, I've noticed that people are stocking up on food, avoiding the subway. But I really want to know what's happening in the hospitals. So, I'm headed to St. Mary's in Manhattan to see how they're coping. Oh, hi. Excuse me, Dr. Ragus?
Hey, put on a face mask, wash your hands, and don't touch anything. Follow me.
This is Dr. Emily Ragus. She's an ER doctor, and she saw some of the first cases of H7N9 in New York.
We're in here.
We ducked into Emily's office. She told me the mortality rate of the flu is dropping. The virus is evolving.
We're still learning what's going on.
At first, 40% of the people who got infected ended up dead. Now, it's only 2%. But Emily told me this is still scary.
2%, that's still really high. It's on par with the worst flu pandemic we've ever seen, the Spanish flu 100 years ago, which killed 50 million people.
That's what we're looking down the barrel of. 50 million dead.
It's not even flu season yet. It's still summer. And I've got people turning up on the ward in their 20s and 30s. We actually had a doctor die here. He was treating patients without a face mask. So you'll forgive me if I don't take mine off. He was only 31. He started getting symptoms. Within the week, he had a fever, a really nasty cough, and he couldn't breathe properly. So we put him on a ventilator. Steroids, antibiotics, nothing helped. He died of a secondary infection. Severe pneumonia.
I'm so sorry.
It was certainly a wake-up call for the medical staff here. No one has immunity to this. And we're on the front lines.
Secondary infections like this are really dangerous. But Dr. Ragus is also seeing something else. When some patients try to fight the virus, your immune system goes into overdrive.
It's called a cytokine storm. Your body ends up attacking itself. It can go after the lungs, making it even harder to breathe. It can affect the liver and kidneys. I've got people in here coughing up blood. So if you're feeling unwell, see a doctor ASAP.
Months since flu virus mutation. Worldwide death toll, 10 million.
Hey, this is Mindy Tuckerman. A couple of weeks ago, the U.S. took a big step to stop the spread of the killer flu. They closed the borders.
Hundreds of flights traveling to the United States have been canceled.
It was a controversial move at the time, but since then, the number of new flu cases has dropped.
What scientists are calling the worst virus in decades now shows signs of abating. That's welcome news to Americans who have spent weeks avoiding crowded places like malls, movie theaters, and stadiums.
Politicians are calling the border closure a victory.
Save 11 minutes via Major Deegan Expressway.
Americans can sleep easier thanks to the steps we've taken to protect them.
To find out when this will end, I went to speak with Dr. John Uzdiansky. He's an epidemiologist from the University of Brooklyn, who is, quite conveniently, my downstairs neighbor. Knock, knock.
Hey, Mindy, come on in.
John's been tracking this flu since the pandemic started. So, is the president right? Has he averted a full-scale flu pandemic in the United States?
No, of course not. That's insane. It won't stop it.
Why not?
Because the flu is already here. Shutting our borders won't make it magically go away.
But we are seeing fewer flu cases.
Yes, but that's not because of the border. We've seen this before. He could have emailed me. I would have told him. My grad students could tell him.
John, what are you talking about?
From everything we know, flu pandemics can come in waves. There's a little one to start, followed by a lull, and then you get smacked in the face with a big wave. That's when people really start getting sick. Some scientists call the first smaller round of sickness the Herald wave.
The Herald wave?
Yeah, so in 2009, the swine flu hit America. There was this outbreak in the spring, and then poof, the virus seemed to drop off. Until just a few months later, flu season picked up when it got colder, and there was this explosion of new cases.
So you're telling me this thing isn't over?
No, far from it. Despite what the president says, I think there's a very good chance that this thing is going to come back in the next few months. It's just a matter of time.
John told me that when it starts to get colder and everyone is stuck inside, it's much easier for the flu to spread. And to make things worse, John told me a vaccine isn't coming anytime soon.
To make a new vaccine, we're basically stuck in the 40s. Most of the time, we're still making vaccines by growing the virus in chicken eggs, for God's sake. It's a really inefficient system. It takes time, up to 6 months or so.
But eventually, we will have a vaccine?
Yeah, eventually. But by then, it's possible we'll have already seen the worst of it.
Months since flu virus mutation. Worldwide death toll, 24 million.
In the U.S., hundreds of thousands are dead and millions are sick. The hospitals are overwhelmed, and authorities in New York are urging people to call 311 before going to the ER. And as I walk into St. Mary's in Manhattan, I can see people being turned away. There's a lot of people here, mostly adults, but also children. Some are lying on the pavement. There's one man who seems to be struggling to breathe. Sir? Are you okay? Sir? Oh, hang on. I'll try to find you a doctor. Sorry. Excuse me. Can I just get... Sorry, I'm not trying to cut the line, but I need to find a nurse.
Everyone, please stop crowding my station.
Wait, is there someone who can help him?
Let me see if I can page someone. Is he a family member?
Oh, no, I don't know him. I'm actually here to see Dr. Rackis. I have an appointment. Is your sister here? She has an interview, right? Never mind. I see her. Next patient, please. Hi, Emily. Yes? It's Mindy. We had an interview scheduled. It's full in here.
This is only the tip of the iceberg. Most of us haven't been home in days. Sorry, what were you doing here?
You were going to give me an update on the flu situation?
Right, look, this isn't a good time.
Of course. I totally understand. Do you think, though, it would be all right if I just follow you on your rounds?
No, I'm sorry, that wouldn't be safe. You really shouldn't be here at all, so do yourself a favor and go home.
But if I could just...
Hey, I'm serious. I don't want to see you next week as a patient.
Snuck into the intensive care ward. No one seems to have noticed. All the doors to the ward are shut, but I can see through some of the windows. All the rooms are full. There seem to be a lot of people connected to ventilators. Most of the patients I can see don't look so good. Their skin is pale. Some of them look a bit blue. There's so many people. But I haven't seen any doctors or nurses yet. It's weird.
What do you mean you don't have a ventilator for her? Ma'am, all our ventilators are used at the moment. So take one from someone else. She's 15. I'm sorry, your daughter is not a good candidate. Her work has Ma'am, sit down. Don't ma'am me! I will rip one out of someone else if I have to! I know this is a painful situation, but I need you to stay. No! Don't control yourself. I will have to call security. Fuck security! And fuck this hospital! And fuck you!
Excuse me? Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, but I couldn't help it over here. Is it true the hospital is out of ventilators?
I'm sorry, who are you?
I'm a journalist. I know I shouldn't be back.
Turn that thing off. Turn that thing off.
This nurse eventually agreed to talk on mic. She told me she hasn't been home in almost a week because a lot of her colleagues aren't coming to work.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, look around. These wards are full. So I get why some of my colleagues stopped showing up. It's a lot to ask.
And it's not just hospitals that are short-staffed. A lot of us aren't turning up to work. And that includes factory workers. So factories around the world aren't pumping out enough of the things we need, like medication. The US has huge stocks of medication for situations like this, and now they've broken the glass.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
And already we're hearing reports that people with diabetes are dying because they couldn't get their insulin.
This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040.
Speed camera in 0.1 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Save 6 minutes via Sprainbrook Parkway North.
Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share. Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
This episode is brought to you by Capital One. With no fees or minimums, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no overdraft fees, is it even a decision? That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One NA, member FDIC.
Prepare to lead with a highly ranked degree from Baruch College's Marx School of Public and International Affairs. Marx offers flexible, affordable graduate and executive level degrees in public administration, international affairs, and higher education administration, drawing upon one of the largest public affairs faculty in the nation. Register for a virtual open house on May 23rd and learn more at marx.baruch.cuny.edu. That's marx.baruch.cuny.edu.
Imagine a service that picks up your laundry and returns it the next day, washed, fluffed, and perfectly folded, all to your exact specifications. That's Happiness. We know that customer satisfaction is everything, which is why we only partner with the best laundromats in your neighborhood. And by using high-efficiency, eco-friendly washers and dryers, we'll get your whites white while keeping the plain. Save time for the important things and leave the laundry to us. To get started, download the app.
7 months since flu virus mutation. Worldwide death toll, over 33 million.
Okay, so this is Mindy Tuckerman. It's been 7 months since the flu hit the U.S. City officials have recommended people work from home if they can. I never thought it would get this bad. Anyway, I was really worried about my neighbor John. He's the epidemiologist we had on the show a few months ago. I hadn't heard him walking around the apartment for a little while, so I knocked on the door and nothing, so I dialed emergency and recorded the conversation.
Hello, 911, what's the emergency?
I'm worried about my neighbor. I haven't seen him in almost a week.
Red light camera ahead.
Red light camera in 0.1 mile.
I tried checking on him, tried calling. I went to his apartment, knocked a bunch, tried his door, and it's locked, and no response.
Okay, we'll get someone out here as soon as we can. What's your address?
Oh, just a second.
Ma'am, I'm Murphy. This is Officer Kelly. Are you Mindy Tucker?
Yes, I am. Thank you for calling. I'm not sure what's going on. He's just not answering.
Sure. Is this your friend's apartment?
Yes. His name is John. It's been at least 5 days since I've seen him. He's in his 60s, so he might have just fallen and hurt himself.
Okay, ma'am. We'll let you know we find.
Speed camera in 0.2 mile. Speed limit is 20 miles per hour.
Hello? Emergency services, open up. Hello, sir. Can you answer the door, please? Your neighbor called to check up on you. John. Can we go in there? Sorry to confirm your neighbor is in fact deceased.
I heard.
We're gonna make arrangements to remove the body. Do you know if your neighbor had any immediate family?
I'm just his neighbor. I don't know his family.
Okay. Don't worry about it, ma'am. We'll take care of it.
The city couldn't reach John's family, so they ended up taking his body to Hart Island. I can see the island from where I'm standing. It served as a cemetery for all the unclaimed dead of New York for over 100 years. And now John's here, along with thousands of other victims of this flu pandemic, buried in long trenches. It's been months since we first heard about this flu, and more than 35 million dead worldwide. The vaccine is finally here, but for millions of people, it's too late. I've seen so many posts from friends who've lost people. It feels like everyone knows someone.
To unpack here, we just theoretically killed off some 35 million people worldwide. But was our scenario realistic? Well, we actually played it for Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So, Anthony, how did we do?
You did really well. I was a little concerned when you started off with the 40% mortality, but when you immediately pivoted and it dropped to 2%, then that became more realistic.
Why would the lethality drop from 40% to 2%?
You don't know, but what you do know is what experience
I think it's a 325 I over there.
That from an evolutionary standpoint,
I didn't know they sold 328.
Disease,
like on that generation.
But they don't like to put themselves out of business. If you had a virus that infected very easily and killed everybody that it infected, the virus would have no more hosts.
And so then when we do think of like a worst case scenario, like when you think of a worst case scenario, do you ever think of a flu virus that is both super deadly and super contagious?
You know, obviously you always put that in the back of your mind.
Hazard reported ahead on Bronx River Parkway north and 700 feet. You're still on the fastest route.
The scenario that you depicted is overwhelmingly the more likely scenario.
So the movies, that's where most of them go wrong then?
Yeah.
So tell us, with this idea of closing the borders then, do you have residents asking you about whether closing the borders is a good idea?
And we always recommend not to.
But they ask.
Well, I mean, it's a reasonable question to come up. Should we be restricting travel, closing the borders? And we always say no. It can make things worse. Because what it doesn't allow for help to come in and supplies. I mean, if you close borders, you're not going to wind up getting any supplies that you need. A lot of our medications come from countries. You close the border, you're not going to get the medications. And as that character in the clip said, it's already here. So sooner or later, the flu will get to you, unquestionably.
The government does have a stockpile of certain medications for times like this. Have you visited the stockpile, by the way? Because I'm imagining like an Indiana Jones warehouse style room. Is that what it looks like?
You know, I can't tell you that, because then you'd ask me where it is, and I can't tell you where it is.
Interesting. Then you'd have to destroy all record of this conversation.
Right.
Do you think hospitals, if we did have a pandemic with a 2% mortality rate, would hospitals run out of ventilators?
Yeah, they definitely will. You know, there's only a certain number of ventilators. I mean, we have stockpiles of ventilators, but when you're talking about a catastrophic pandemic, you almost never have enough of them. So that is something that is a problem. So the scene of running out of a respirator is an entirely realistic scene.
And in our scenario, it took about 6 months to get a new vaccine.
Right.
Is that realistic?
Well, unfortunately, it is. Right now, today, if we got hit this moment, we would have to rely predominantly on a vaccine that's made by growing the virus in eggs. That is not the optimal way.
So a vaccine really could turn up after the worst of a pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. The vaccine that we had available in 2009 was available after the peak of the outbreak in the United States.
Chatting with Anthony about our episode, though, he did take issue with one choice in our story: the strain of flu virus, H7N9. Anthony told us that pandemics in the past have actually come from flu viruses that no one saw coming.
I mean, obviously, for the sake of the show, you did a good logical extrapolation from an H7N9 that was smoldering to one that mutated and went to humans. That could happen, and we need to be prepared for it. But historically, I repeat, historically, the most likely evolution of a pandemic would be literally out of nowhere, the way it happened in 1918, 1957, 1968, and 2009.
I guess, like, how should we feel about the potential for a big pandemic? You know, how does it keep you up at night?
Well, nothing keeps me up at night. I work too hard. I sleep very well. Just kidding. We will have another pandemic. We've had them in the past. We've recently had one in 2009. We cannot predict when the next pandemic will be, but we can be almost certain that it will occur. Will it occur in the next 10 years? No idea. Will it occur next year? No idea. But history tells us that sooner or later, we will have another pandemic. We could be lucky, like in 2009, when we had a pandemic that wasn't particularly lethal. Or we could be really unlucky, like in 1918, when we had a pandemic that was catastrophic.
That 1918 pandemic that Anthony is talking about was the Spanish flu, where some 50 million people died. It's what some of the scenario that you just heard is based on. Now, the world has changed a lot since then. We have things like ventilators and antibiotics, but there's also a lot more people and more travel. And as you heard, we're still really vulnerable. So, what can we do to learn from the past and stop this kind of pandemic from happening again? Well, all the researchers we spoke to, including Anthony, told us that better vaccines are really key here. We need a universal flu vaccine that will work for all kinds of flu viruses. The research on that is ongoing. And in the meantime, we need to improve how we make vaccines and stop growing them in chicken eggs. But the experts that we spoke to also told us that viruses are a fact of life and death.
That was brutal.
Yeah, I mean, listen, not to call you out, but I saw you tearing up a couple times.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, I did. It hit you when that first doctor died. And then the ventilator scene.
I know. I mean, I thought I was gonna cry. I thought, because there was some moments, it's not that, it was like, those early days in New York, like in March, I remember there were just sentences that academics actually told us that we had made up, and I couldn't believe it. That line from the professor that was like, it's already here, it's already here. I remember speaking to the virologist who was basically that guy, like who was like the real version of that guy, and I remember him saying that as well. Those exact words.
I remember that too. It's already here. I remember that.
Yeah. What about you? What hit you?
The Heart Island thing. When they were burying folks in our episode.
Yes.
Like there were people who were buried at Heart Island during COVID. And I remember when that happened during the pandemic. I remember seeing those news stories, and that is like what gave me goosebumps. I was like, oh gosh.
I think it's just so sad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so sad about how naive we sounded in this episode. That it was like a game that we would make a fictional ep about it. Oh gosh, I'm just gonna blow my nose and then let's talk science. Let's get this emotional shit.
I want to talk about your feelings, Wendy.
Okay. What did we get right? What did we get wrong?
Yeah, and listen, point of order, I will say, I don't know wrong wrong and right is quite it. I think it's what, where did our fictional pandemic line up with COVID and where did it not?
Right, okay. Yes, because I guess in the future we could have a pandemic like the one.
Wendy, don't say it. Everyone already thinks we're witches.
Okay. Okay. So things that happened in sync, that happened in this episode and then happened in real life. The virus did come out of China.
Yeah.
Which we picked for a couple of reasons. One is because there are these models that scientists use to try to predict where the next pandemic could come out of, and they use things like the population of a place and diversity of wildlife, because many of our new viruses come from animals.
Mm-hmm.
And using these models, they know that China is hotspot, along with other countries. So that's one reason we picked it. Another reason is that H7N9, the flu virus that this whole fictional episode is based on, that first emerged in China. Other stuff we were right about, medical staff being overwhelmed, masks is in this episode, that moment where Mindy's opening the door to the police and she's like, I'll just get my mask. Like now it's like, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But that was like a little creative flair we just added, like, oh, she's probably gonna grab her mask. And I was like, oh wow, I can't believe that felt so real. The cytokine storm causing bigger illness, the waves of disease, we talked about that happened. But now turning to the stuff that did not line up. So one of the most obvious was that the real pandemic was caused by a coronavirus, whereas we talked about it happening with a flu virus, which is what scientists had been expecting. Although very prescient, that Fauci was like, it comes out of nowhere, it'll come out of nowhere. So, points to Fauci for that one.
Right. You win this one, Anthony. But the fact that we picked a flu virus to cause this fictional pandemic, it also meant that a lot of the conversation we had around the vaccines ended up being off, right?
Right.
Because we make our flu vaccines in chicken eggs, and for the COVID vaccines, like, that's not what we did. We use these different tools, including like the mRNA vaccines.
Yes, which was a miracle. It was a miracle that we got them as fast as we did.
Oh my God.
Within a year or so, people were getting COVID vaccines. It was a science miracle.
Right.
But either way, in our scenario, it was different.
Yeah.
And it also felt like in ours, way more people were dying.
Red light camera in 0.1 mile.
So, okay, look, in our fictional pandemic, after 7 months, 35 million people had died globally. Now, for COVID, as of early May 2023, around 7 million people have died, according to the WHO, according to the best numbers we've got, right?
Right.
But, actually our mortality rate actually ended up being not too far off.
Really? Because we started with that very high mortality rate, but then switched to 2%. What happened in real life?
Yeah. So, in real life, it definitely dropped for COVID too. So, like, basically it peaked at almost 8%. And that was at the end of April 2020. And then it went down. And, not necessarily because of mutations, like we talked about in the episode, but partly because in the beginning, you're really catching, like, the sickest people. The people who have to go to the hospital, and you're not catching the people that didn't get that sick. So as our data got better, the mortality rate for COVID went down to about 2%, and that matched our figure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then from there, it dropped down to, like, around 1%. Obviously, that was, like, after we had vaccines and stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think the reason that our model had predicted so many deaths is because we hadn't thought that countries were going to be going into lockdown as quickly as they did, right? In our scenario, Mindy's working from home 7 months in.
I'm like, Mindy, what are you doing? Stay home.
That's bonkers. And in reality, that happened, relatively quickly, right?
Right. It happened, Wuhan went into lockdown pretty, early 2020, and then in the U.S., like, by the early March was when we first started hearing about cases popping up in the U.S. and spreading, and, like, within 2 weeks of that, by the middle of March, it's like lockdowns were happening. So it was bam. It was so fast compared to what we thought it might be based on our episode. A couple things I wanted to mention that always stood out to me. Well, number one, actually, is one thing that I think we found is kind of wrong, is the idea that border closings don't do anything. Right. I mean, you know, Fauci kind of talked about it. It's like, we always say no. Did you like my Fauci accent? We always tell people not to do that. But forget about it. But actually, there is some evidence that, you know, that can slow things down potentially. I mean, New Zealand, you know, like we saw that.
Australia. Yeah.
Australia.
Why are you going to talk about New Zealand? I'm right here, fine.
I don't want you to get a big head over there. So the most famous of the Australasian countries, New Zealand. Close their borders. But I mean, and look, you know, like that made a very obvious difference.
Yes.
And actually, there was a review paper that came out just a few months ago, and they looked at lots of countries that closed their borders, and they found basically sometimes it did seem to help, especially if you close early and use that time to do stuff like prepare. And other times it really didn't help, you know. So I think it's just like not as cut and dry maybe as we presented it. And one thing that, you know what, one question that Meryl, one of our senior producers, kept having as we were talking about this episode is like, what about the ferrets? I don't remember using any ferrets during COVID. Like, were they using ferrets?
I remember that too. We were like, we just predicted a worldwide pandemic. Forget about the weasels.
Well, for the Meryls of the world who are wondering, we can confirm that yes, in fact, there were ferrets used in sort of testing the how infectious COVID was. For those who are concerned, it happened
about ferret viewer.
Exactly, a Will Ferret.
Yes.
Incredible. Yeah.
Yes. And I mean, just zooming out here a little bit, the fact that we did create this episode, the fact that, like, I know this wasn't perfect, exactly right by any means, but the fact that by using these scientific papers and documents, which is what our fictional episode was based on, you know, we were able to get pretty close. To me, really shows how much the science wasn't surprised by what happened.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, listen, you know, we should have listened to the scientists. Is that what you're saying, Wendy?
Yes, that is what I'm saying. But I guess the real lesson of the episode is that next time we make a fictional episode, we will make it about how the world is full of rainbows and starshine.
Maybe we fix climate change.
Exactly.
We'll manifest that into the world. Thanks, Blythe. Thanks, Wendy.
That's Science Versus. Oh, and Blythe.
Yeah.
How many citations in this week's episode?
Oh, in this week's episode, we have 185 citations.
185. That is...
Listen, we have a lot of pandemic science, Wendy, it turns out.
We sure do, and we've been adding to it plentifully over the last few years. We did want to do a call out as well to two people who did an incredible amount of work on that fictional episode. The first is Caitlin Sorey, who is the lead producer on this episode, just did an amazing job. She now has her own podcast company called F&K Media. Go check it out. And then also Peter Leonard, who did the sound engineering for it. And oh my god, like listening back, I just could feel all of his blood, sweat, and tears. Next week is our episode on skincare.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited for you to tell me how to look less old and withered. Sorry, weathered, I guess I should say. Maybe both.
That's right. Is there anything you can slap on your skin to make your wrinkles go away? All right, see you, Blythe.
Okay, bye.
The original pandemic episode was produced by Caitlin Sorey, with help from me, Wendy Zuckerman, Michelle Dang, Lexi Krupp, Rose Rimler, and Meryl Horn. It was edited by Caitlin Kenny and Blythe Terrell. Extra writing help from Kevin Christopher Snipes. Fact-checking by Diane Kelly. Mix and sound design by Peter Leonard. Music written by Peter Leonard, Bobby Lord, and Marcus Thornbagala. This new update was produced by Rose Rimler, fact-checked by Erica Akiko Howard, and mixed by Bobby Lord. Thank you to all of the scientists and researchers that we got in touch with to build this episode, including Dr. Eric Toner, Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis, Beth Malden Morgenthau, Dr. Melvin Sanicus, Dr. Mandy Izzo, Dr. Kurt Frey, Professor Michael Osterholm, Dr. Patrick Saunders Hastings, Rosemary Gibson, Thomas Bollicky, Dr. Ashley Tweet, Professor Stephen Morse, Dr. Lalitha Sundraham, Professor David N. Fissman, Lynette Brammer, the late Dr. Mohammed Naguib, Dr. Yulong Shu, Dr. Dan Jernigan, Dr. Kirsty Short, and a special thanks to Bess Davenport at the CDC. A huge thanks to all of our actors. Annabelle Fox played Mindy, as well as the late William Dufries, Alice Kors, Danny Carbone, Robin Miles, Jordan Cobb, Jonathan Woodward, Ian Lowe, and Casey.
Here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. One person's hallucination can be easily dismissed, but what happens when an entire crowd has the same hallucination or suffers from the same mental illness? It's enough to make somebody believe in magic and pick up their pitchfork, ready to hang an accused witch. Now, such mass delusions have led to witch hunts in the past. In today's episode from the archives, we look at some of the most notorious historical cases of mass hysteria and moral panics. But these cases don't only extend to Puritan-style witch hunts. We'll also look at cases that hit closer to home, like economic bubbles that led to the housing market crash of the early 2000s, which in many ways mirrored the Dutch tulip bubble of the 1630s. Other historical moral panics include dancing mania, in which German peasants in 1374 spent weeks dancing in a fugue state, with some toppling over dead from hyperexhaustion. We'll also look at the cat nuns in medieval France, where the sisters began to inexplicably meow together, leaving the surrounding community perplexed. We'll also look at the Jersey Devil panic, in which dozens of newspapers claimed in 1909 that a winged creature attacked the trolley car in Haddon Heights. Hope you enjoyed this episode. And one more thing before we get started with this episode, a quick break for a word from our sponsors.
Can you have too many houseplants? I don't think so. Yet some leaf to grow.
Keeping and spreading the records we have of this period, other people behave like this, but it was nuns who were disproportionately affected. And over the next 200 years, in nunneries all over Western Europe, hundreds were plunged into states of delirium, where they screamed and convulsed and confessed to having carnal relations with devils. We have all these documents that attest to these things happening, including trial documents in the archives of Inquisition records, or church trials for heresy. We have copious in-depth accounts and testimonies of nuns doing some very strange things. So what was going on here? What caused dozens of people, or even hundreds of people, to dance non-stop for weeks or months on end, act like animals, and to claim possession? There's been all sorts of suggestions for why these things happened. In the early centuries, at the end of the Middle Ages or the beginning of the Renaissance, the easiest explanation was actually some form of possession. But even at the time, there were contemporary observers who thought that there was some sort of sickness. They could have been divinely afflicted, but it could have been a natural affliction as well, a sort of garden variety madness. In more recent decades, many have turned to a biological explanation. Maybe they ingested a mold containing psychotropic chemicals that caused them to hallucinate. But more recently, scholars have turned to the field of psychology and anthropology to argue that the dancing plagues and possession epidemics were classic instances of mass psychogenic illness, or crowd psychology. I'm going to be talking about mass delusion in this episode, events where this happened, possible explanations, and how people of the time and historians of today have tried to interpret these events. This has to do with a question that comes from Bill Frezza. Bill is a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, the membership program of History Unplugged, and as such, he can ask me questions about history, and I will do my best to answer them. So what Bill asks me is to talk about the history of moral panics, from the Salem witch hunt to the Fells Acre Daycare Satanic Child Abuse Inquisition. And I had a question from another listener who asked me about the Puritans as well, in the Salem witch trials, and he says this: most of the writings about New England during the 1600s revolve around the Puritans. It concludes with the Salem witch trials, and then nothing after. It's almost as if after the Puritans disappear. I can't find anything about the Puritans in the 1700s or beyond. What happened? My theory is that in the 1700s, with more people, that meant less of them by percentage were Puritans, so less coverage was given to them. Also, with more events happening in the 1700s, the less interesting Puritans went from less coverage to no coverage. So I'm going to lump that question about the Puritans into the first one about mass delusions and mass psychology, because as the listener hints in his own question, he kind of answers it, where the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, once we get into the 18th century, proportionately they're less and less a percentage of New England, and they don't have as much impact as they did before, even though Puritan religious culture still stays very strong in New England for centuries to come. But let's get back to this question about mass hallucination in history. First, I wanted to touch on these events in question, the 1374 dancing outbreak and nuns who claim to be possessed, talk about them a little bit. Then I'm going to get into psychology a little bit more and look at different psychological theories that explain how mass delusions can take place. Then we're going to look in more detail at the most notorious case of mass delusion, and that was the Salem witch trial, and how it bears resemblance to similar events that happen today. Finally, we'll see that in history, mass delusion wasn't just exotic events like a huge dancing outbreak, but we can also tie into more mainstream events like economic bubbles, such as the tulip bubble in the Netherlands in the 1600s, where tulips were outrageously priced. It was one of the worst economic bubbles in history. Now today, we see similar economic bubbles happening in economics. So you or I, or the general population, isn't as immune to these types of mass delusions as we might think, even though we might not spend weeks or months dancing to complete exhaustion. Well, first, let's circle back to an explanation to these outbreaks, such as the dancing outbreak. Beyond these people possibly ingesting psychotropic mold, one clue to the cause of these events is that they appear to involve dissociative trance. This is a condition that involves, among other things, a loss of self-control. It'd be hard to imagine people dancing for days on end when their feet are getting bloodied, except if they were in an altered state of consciousness. But eyewitness accounts of these dancers state that they weren't fully conscious. Onlookers describe them as being wild, frenzied, and seeing visions. One person noted that while they danced, their minds were no longer clear, and another person described them as having wearied themselves for dancing and jumping. They went raging like beasts over the land. The hundreds of nuns who claimed to be possessed were described in chronicles and legal records as also being subject to dissociative trance. So how do we explain these epidemics of dissociation? Again, some people say that the nuns might have eaten bread made from contaminated flour and ingested psychotropic mold, but this probably wouldn't have caused dancing to go on for weeks or months. Rather, there's strong indication that certain communities are unusually prone to epidemic possession. They might have been more prone to psychological stress, and there's a good connection between psychological stress and dissociation. And this correlation could have led to mass psychogenic illness. So here's one interpretation of the dancing epidemic of 1374. Keep in mind, this takes place in a very rough century in Europe. This is right on the heels of the Black Plague, and in the Rhine River Valley, there was terrible flooding had just taken place. Chronicles talk about the Rhine River rising 34 feet and floodwaters pouring over town walls and homes and marketplaces being submerged. You see decomposing livestock in the streets. And similarly, in 1518, in the decades before that dancing plague, there was famine, sickness, the medieval cold period, unusually cold weather, which created unusual hardship in Strasbourg. Bread prices reached their highest levels in a generation due to bad harvests. There were thousands of starving farmers and vine growers, and new outbreaks of the plague in the early 1500s. You now had syphilis. It had arrived from the New World and was causing all sorts of problems in Europe. So these difficulties could explain some of the dancing outbreak in the 1300s and 1500s. But what about all the cases of nuns acting erratically? Well, nunneries weren't a place of just quiet contemplation and quiet prayer before God. Some nuns probably experienced that. But in the late medieval and early modern period, other nunneries could have been bad psychological environments. Some sisters didn't join a nunnery on their own volition, but maybe their parents wished that they joined, or forced them to join, whether due to economic hardship or they thought that a nunnery would tame an unruly daughter rather than any sort of piety on their part. Once inside, and once you took your holy orders, it was very difficult to get out. And this feeling of inadequacy for not living up to holy orders could have been psychological devastating for some. One notable example is that of Jeanne d'Agnay, the Mother Superior of a Loudun nunnery in southern France, and she became infatuated with the local priest, Father Grandier, in 1627. She confessed, "When I did not see him, I burned with desire for him." In consequence, Jeanne felt overwhelmed with guilt. After weeks of penance and introspection, she fell into a dissociative state in which she repeatedly accused Grandier of plotting with Satan to make her lust after him. As a Mother Superior, she was influential, and this could have affected several other nuns, because within days, many more followed suit, and they also blamed the priest. After an investigation from the Inquisition, Grandier was declared guilty and burned alive. There's a lot we don't know about this case, but there's a collective psychology also in operation here. But one theory on why these cases pop so much from the 14th century to the 17th or 18th century is that people are more likely to experience a dissociative trance if they already believe in the possibility of spiritual possession, rather than something like this happening in a vacuum. It means that minds can be prepared to shift into altered states if it's taught that these sort of altered states can happen. The anthropologist Erica Bourgeonon wrote about an environment of belief in the 90s, a set of ideas about the spirit world that members of communities absorbed that prepared them to achieve the possession state. So the dancers of 1374 and 1518 occupied an environment of belief that accepted the possibility of a divine curse or possession or bewitchment. So their metaphysical beliefs made it possible for them to enter the state and to have others affected by the state. So the dancing plagues were reliant on a belief system in communities where there was a pre-existing belief in the possibility of something like a dancing curse happening. Amongst the dancers in 1374, many believed that Satan had unleashed an irresistible dance, but they also begged for divine intercession and went to holy sites and submitted to exorcism. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were convinced that a saint called Vitus had unleashed a dancing curse, and once they entered the possession state, it seemed they acted in accordance with the conventions of the St. Vitus myth, dancing for days on end. And the dance turned epidemic because each new victim who joined this huge dance lent further credibility to belief that something supernatural was happening. What's interesting is that nearly all possession epidemics occurred within a 300-year period from around 1400 to the 1700s. This is a period where religious writers insisted that such events were possible, and theologians, inquisitors, and exorcists established the rules of mass demonic possession, to which dissociated nuns unconsciously conformed, doing things like writhing, foaming, convulsing, speaking in tongues, and making obscene gestures. So they're acting out stereotypical performances based on deep-seated beliefs. And in this podcast, I've talked about how there's a myth about witch burnings that they happened all throughout the Middle Ages, but really, you don't see widespread belief in witches happening until really the end of the Middle Ages, but not even the Middle Ages, more like the early modern period, especially during warfare and battle between Protestants and Catholics in the 16th and 17th centuries. A lot of medieval scholars tried to teach peasants that witches didn't exist. They believed in magic, they believed in the supernatural, but not in witches.
There's like a trail for it.
In the 1100s and 1200s, you don't have people who think that
it was a railroad owned by the Erie Railroad.
Into witchcraft because it's
there's a trail that runs along it, like right over here.
When authorities are charging people with witchcraft in the 14, 15, 1600s,
maybe it's that the end of that light rail,
then you do see the outbreak of a lot.
No, that's supposed to end in Tenafly, but it's the same branch.
This is the time period in Puritan America when the Salem witch trials are happening, well after the Middle Ages, nearly into the age of the Enlightenment, when one of the most notorious witch trials happens.
Apparently they stopped moving forward on it.
One book from the 19th century interprets the dancing
because Tenafly complained about it.
It has an interesting interpretation, and I want to mention it here. This book is by J.F.C. Hecker, entitled The Epidemics of the Middle Ages, and it came out in 1859. And he thinks that the dancing epidemic is somehow connected to Europe's pre-Christian past, and there's a thread from the pagan era going all the way up into the 1400s that might explain what's happening. Here's what he says. He thinks that the dancing mania has to do with the celebration of St. John's Day, or a feast day for St. John the Baptist. He thinks that this festival has a connection to Europe's pre-Christian past. Here's what he says. The manner in which John the Baptist was worshipped afforded an important and very evident cause for its development. As with all sorts of strange and rude customs, of which the originally mystical meaning was variously disfigured among different nations by superadded relics of heathenism. Thus the Germans transferred to the festival of St. John's Day an ancient heathen usage, the kindling of the Notfire, which was forbidden them by St. Boniface, and the belief subsists even to the present day that people and animals that have leaped through these flames or their smoke are protected for a whole year from fevers and other diseases, as if by a kind of baptism by fire. Bacchanalian dances, which have originated in similar causes among all the rude nations of the earth, and the wild extravagances of a heated imagination, were the constant accompaniments of this half-heathen, half-Christian festival. At the period of which we are treating, however, the Germans were not the only people who gave way to the ebullitions of fanaticism in keeping the festival of St. John the Baptist. Similar customs were also to be found among the nations of southern Europe and of Asia, and it is more than probable that the Greeks transferred to the festival of John the Baptist, who is also held in high esteem among the Mohammedans, part of their bacchanalian mysteries, an absurdity of a kind which is but too frequently met with in human affairs. How far remembrance of the history of St. John's death may have had influence on this occasion, we would leave learned theologians to decide. It is only of importance here to add that in Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, a country entirely separated from Europe, where Christianity has maintained itself in its primeval simplicity against Mohammedanism, John is to this day worshipped as protecting saints of those who are attacked with the dancing malady. These fragments of the domination of mysticism and superstition, historical connection is not to be found. Okay, so this book is charming in its own way. It's written in the 19th century with the very beginnings of anthropology and ethnography. I've seen a few of these books from the 19th century, and to their credit, these researchers are trying to understand human tradition away from official church narratives or official history. But because of that, sometimes they go too far in the opposite direction, where they see a pre-Christian or pagan or Roman tradition kept alive in the folk population. Scratch a peasant and you'll find a still beating heart of paganism buried underneath that's somehow been maintained for 1,500 or 1,800 years. So they can go a little bit too far in that opposite interpretation. But hey, it takes a long time to build up a field, so you can't criticize these people too much. Before we get into the Salem witch trials, there's a more contemporary book that tries to explain social delusion and mass psychogenic illness. It has more contemporary explanations. This book is called Little Green Men, Meowing Nuns, and Head-Hunting Panics by Robert Bartholomew. So he notes that what we call mass hysteria can also be known by such labels as epidemic hysteria, contagious hysteria, and mass psychogenic illness.
No, it's not the high school.
To break it down a little bit more, British psychiatrist Simon Wesley identified two types affecting groups: anxiety hysteria and motor hysteria. So anxiety hysteria, which we haven't really seen in these cases that I described, has a rapid onset and recovery time, and it usually lasts just a day. And it's triggered by a perception of a threatening agent, usually a strange odor or rumor of tainted food. Symptoms include headaches, dizziness, nausea. So the symptoms result from an overwhelming stress reaction to sudden anxiety. Under rare circumstances, anxiety hysteria can spread to communities. This usually appears within cohesive, enclosed social units, like a nunnery or a Puritan community of Salem, Massachusetts. But the imaginary harmful agent is at large within the community in question, and anyone is viewed as a potential victim. So some episodes have involved rumors of the use of poison gas against ethnic minorities who distrust distant central governments, including the Palestinian fear of the Israelis or Soviet-Georgian suspicion of Moscow. Mass motor hysteria develops more slowly than anxiety hysteria. It occurs in an atmosphere of accumulating long-term stress, group stress. It can occur in tightly controlled social situations like strict school or religious settings where discipline is extreme, and symptoms include trance-like states, melodramatic acts of rebellion, where pent-up anxiety builds over a long period of time resulting in disruptions to nerves or neurons, sending messages to the muscles and triggering bouts of twitching, spasms, and shaking. These symptoms appear gradually and usually take weeks or months to subside. One episode of motor hysteria occurred over several months in 1972 in a Canadian community where most people were of Aboriginal descent. They were descended from Cree and Ojibwe tribal groups. Psychiatrists who went to the village interviewed 13 residents between the ages of 11 and 18, and they noticed the life was very dreary. They typically complained of fatigue, irritability, headaches, and nightmares prior to having hysterical fits during which they try to run into the woods. This coincided with their anger and depression over cultural isolation in the village, where they lived under strict discipline, scant privacy, and prearranged marriages. In this case, a traditional society was undergoing rapid social change, which placed extraordinary stress on certain groups that were low in the power hierarchy. So, based on most contemporary psychology literature, most epidemic hysteria episodes occur within closed, tightly knit social settings, such as schools, factories, convents, and hospitals. There have been several reports of events that were labeled as community-wide, but mass hysterias in the social science literature of the 20th century usually don't involve the spread of hysterical conversion and anxiety. And there's plenty of historical examples of group delusions, many which can seem humorous to those outside of the cultural setting. In Leeds, England in 1806, residents became terror-stricken that the end of the world was about to happen when a hen began laying eggs with the inscription, "Christ is coming." Masses gathered to look at the bird until they discovered that the eggs had been inscribed with the corrosive ink and forced back into the hen's body. Unfortunately, we have plenty of other collective delusions that are more sinister, such as racial persecution under Nazis, mass suicide and religious cults, witch hunts, scares of communist infiltration, and other activities that happen in cults. One of the biggest results of mass hysteria has to do with immediate community threats. This includes exaggerated feelings of danger within communities when members of the affected population are concerned over what is believed to be an immediate personal danger. Episodes usually persist from a few weeks to several months, and participants may express excitement and concern. An example of an immediate community threat occurred in New Jersey in 1909. Since at least the early 1700s, there had been stories of bizarre creatures in the desolate Pine Barrens region of central and southern New Jersey. There were sightings of what people called the Jersey Devil until the turn of the 20th century, when there weren't sightings reported and this faded into folklore. But between January 16th and January 23rd, 1909, there were several sightings of the creature or its footprints. The description that was given was that it was said to stand 3 to 4 feet high, with a head resembling a horse, and it had bat-like wings. Others said that it was only as big as a dog. Folklorists James McCloy and Ray Miller said in their book, The Jersey Devil, that during the brief scare, most residents stayed behind locked doors